Now we're going to talk about segmenting. So segmenting is technically what we refer to as third-degree price discrimination, but like perfect price discrimination, it is a form of direct price discrimination. So in this case, firms are charging customers different prices before they purchase the good, but that different price is based on their group um, membership, right? So in the first video, I mentioned that firms are going to group consumers into different identities based on their perceived willingness to pay. So, for example, students are often viewed as being less willing to pay for something than non-students because students are often working less than non-students, not always, but often, meaning that they have a tighter budget and they also already have this immense expenditure of the university. And so firms are going to tend to provide students with discounts that they don't provide to non-students. So student discounts at the movie theater, at different museums, at different events, right, are all forms of segmenting, right? Where they say, okay, if you belong to this student group, and often you have to demonstrate that membership before purchase, you can access this lower price, right? And students are going to want to opt into that, right? They're going to want to pay less if they can. And so firms expect them to reveal that their group membership before they purchase. If you look on the slide here, there's that image of early bird specials at IHOP. I pulled this for a few years ago, so it's probably no longer $5 anymore. But these types of early bird specials are often targeting another often cash-strapped group of seniors, right? People who are on Social Security, who are no longer working and thus have a tighter budget, who are willing to get up really early and often and go to breakfast at like 6 a.m. And thus willing to pay less for that breakfast. And so firms will try to capture those consumers as well, bring them out from their homes to have breakfast at IHOP by offering those discounts. And usually folks who are not seniors, right, on weekdays, they're not going out to IHOP for breakfast, right? They're getting ready for work. And so that's how IHOP ensures that those folks who are coming in are likely going to be those with a lower willingness to pay for their breakfast already. Okay. So when firms segment, they can segment, like I've said, according to customer characteristics, but we might also see them using consumers' past purchasing behavior to guide their price that they show. So Amazon used to do this, right? It faced a lawsuit about it, so I don't think it does it anymore, but it would use people's past purchasing behavior to change the prices that the person saw for different goods. Airlines will also do this, right? Look at when you tend to buy, what you tend to buy for business or pleasure, right? And adjust your price that you see for different flights accordingly. We might also see firms price discriminate based on location. So for example, if you're in a poorer area of town, right, maybe the gas stations charge you less for gas, right, a few cents less, and maybe grocery prices are a little lower than they are in a more rich area. Similarly, what we might expect is that on campus stores, like the bookstore, is going to charge more for a book than, say, Barnes& Noble or Amazon will. And then lastly, we're also going to see segmenting according to time horizon. So often business travelers, people who are making their purchases the same week that they're intending to fly out, or people who sort of are operating on that last minute schedule, are willing to pay more for a flight or for a trip than someone who's planning a vacation months in advance, right? That person who's planning a vacation is going to shop around, find the lowest prices they can, and book that, whereas that business traveler is going to book whatever is first available, right? And so we see some price discrimination happening there as firms segment consumers according to how far in advance they're purchasing. Graphically, when we represent markets where segmenting happens, it requires us to draw now two graphs because what the firm essentially does is split the market in two. So we'll have, if we use the example of tourists versus locals, we'll have folks who are tourists and have a higher willingness to pay for some event or good or experience than locals might, right? Um, um, for example, you might see that tourists are going to use the like hop on, hop off buses in San Diego, whereas locals aren't going to, right? Locals are going to be more aware of the geography of the city, how to get around, the best ways to get around, the cheapest ways to get around than someone who is a tourist, okay? And we can see the differences in their willingness to pay by the height and slope of their respective demand curves. And not slope, I should say elasticity, right? But we can kind of get it from the slope. So for the tourists, we see that that demand choke price is a much higher than it is for the locals, $100 higher, in fact, where tourists are willing to pay up to $340 for whatever this good is. Maybe it's a week-long, right? Pass for the hop on, hop off bus, whereas locals are only willing to pay $240. Okay. And we can see that locals are actually very responsive to changes in price because their demand curve is much flatter, right, than is the tourists, right? Tourists have a much more inelastic demand curve, meaning they're going to be less price responsive. So as the price goes up, their quantity demanded is going to fall much less than will that of locals. Okay. And what that means for our firm is that they're going to be able to mark up the price for that ticket, week-long ticket, much higher above their marginal cost for a tourist than they will for locals. Because if they price up too much for locals, they're just going to switch to something else, whereas the tourists will switch less. Okay. So we can see the marginal cost of providing that seat on the bus is $100, right? Whether the person is local or a tourist. But for the tourist, the firm's able to charge $220, whereas for the local, they're only able to charge $170. And so what we're going to see as we get to the practice problems is that by splitting the market in this way, by separating tourists from locals, the tour bus is actually able to sell more of the good and thus increase their profits and producer surplus. Okay. So you can see that their producer surplus for the tourists is much larger than for the locals. And if they had to price at the tourist price, they would basically price out a lot of those locals and that their producer surplus would be much lower. Okay. How much they decide to produce is going to be, for each market, is going to be the same as we saw for monopoly, right? Again, they're just splitting one market into two. So they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and then add that markup. And it's that markup that's going to be varying most between the two markets because of the differences in their willingness to pay, as shown by their respective demand curves. Okay, and we'll do an example of segmenting during in the practice problem video as well. So one thing to consider, can we use price discrimination to explain the pink tax? All right. For those of you who don't know, the pink tax is this idea that people have noticed where things that are pink and marketed towards women tend to be priced higher than those same items that are not pink and marketed towards men. So for instance, razors, right? Often women's razors are pink and men's razors are blue. And so we see women's razors often being priced at a higher price point than men's are. And this we can explain using segmenting, right? Essentially what firms are doing here is noticing that for women, the cost of not shaving is much higher than it is for men. And so women are going to be willing to pay more. And so when they charge women, they're going to charge a higher price, right, than they would for men. So let's see if I have a slide I can draw on here. So we'll draw the market for men on the left for razors. Okay. And on the right, we'll do women. And what the firm is seeing is that women's willingness to pay is much steeper, much more inelastic, excuse me. Whereas for men, theirs is much flatter, right? And the demand choke price is lower, meaning they're not willing to pay as much, okay? So even though the marginal cost of producing the razors is the same, the firms are going to charge women a lot more, right? And if they had to charge men the price that women are charged, right, most men would just go without shaving. Okay, and we'll revisit this example in class, but you can start to see price discrimination in play. All right, next we're going to turn to indirect price discrimination. There's going to be a lot of different pricing strategies involved here, so we're going to leave this to the next video.